Change in leadership at the Nebraska Medical Cannabis Commission today. Chairwoman Dr. Monica Oldenburg resigned at the start of the meeting. Governor Jim Pillen had appointed her last May. Now, until the governor appoints a replacement, Laurel Muting, who was appointed alongside Dr. Oldenburg, will serve as the interim chair. The commission is made up of the 3 state liquor control commission commissioners, plus 2 more people appointed by the governor.
And at almost the same time, the legislature heard testimony on a bill which would take the power to appoint members of the Cannabis Commission away from the governor and give it to the voters. It's LB 934, and it was introduced by Omaha Senator John Kavanaugh. It would make the Medical Cannabis Commission an elected office. So, if passed, voters would elect the Medical Cannabis Commissioners to a 4-year term. Under present law, the commission is made up of 5 members, all indirectly or directly appointed by the governor. This change would make the commissioners directly accountable to voters with less influence from the governor.
I proposed it because I don't think that the commission is respecting the will of the voters, and that if we had an elected commission, that they would be more closely held to the voters and therefore more closely reflect what the will of the voters are.
No one rose to speak in opposition to the bill today.
And medical cannabis advocates have grown increasingly frustrated with the commission in recent months. Late last year, the commission introduced a restrictive set of rules on how the state's medical cannabis system will operate. Under the rules, smoking or vaping cannabis is illegal. Consumption would be restricted to pills and creams, which some advocates say directly contradicts the will of the voters who overwhelmingly approved medical cannabis in 2024. And the start of the state's program still seems a way off. At last check, the commission has only awarded 2 of 4 licenses to grow cannabis in the state.